Hi guys, it's me, CHD, and welcome to yet another episode of the podcast. And it's actually a year since I started this podcast, because the first episode I did was on last year's Austrian Grand Prix. And of course, we are talking about this year's Austrian Grand Prix today. An Austrian Grand Prix that yesterday was not exactly a classic, but it was still a fun race. We had plenty of battles. Until the very end of the race, it was still a very interesting Grand Prix, especially in that midfield pack. But yeah, it wasn't the greatest race, but still a good one. And we thankfully had a fight from lap 1 all the way to lap 71 for the lead, which you don't always get in Formula 1. But let's get into what the results were from the Austrian Grand Prix. And for the first time in 24 years, McLaren win in Austria. And not only that, they get a 1-2, the first time they've had that in 25 years at this track. Lando Norris winning for McLaren, Oscar Piastri just behind in second, Charles Leclerc third, Lewis Hamilton fourth, George Russell fifth, over a minute behind. I just cannot explain why Mercedes was so slow in the Grand Prix. The heat, maybe, but yeah, that was a terrible, probably the worst race of Mercedes' season. It was reminiscing of sometimes how bad it got, last year at the start of the season. For them, it really was a horrible Grand Prix. Liam Lawson, 6th. What a result for him. Fernando Alonso, 7th. Great result for him. Gabriel Bortoleto, 8th. First points in Formula 1. Congratulations to him. Nico Hülkenberg, 9th. Started last, finished 9th. What a result. And for me, driver of the day was Hülkenberg. And 10th, also a brilliant drive from Esteban Ocon. Yet again scoring points from a low down position. And keeping Haas in a good position in the championship. Haas now, I'm pretty sure, are 6th in the championship. We'll get onto that in a moment. But yeah, those are the results from the Austrian Grand Prix. Let's go on to how it affects, firstly, the Drivers' Championship standings. Oscar Piastri, still in the lead, 15 points clear of Lando Norris, who takes his 3rd win of the season. And for Max Verstappen, he is now 61 points behind after being eliminated by Kimi Antonelli from the Grand Prix. Verstappen, at best, his championship is hanging on by a thread, and it could very well be over in the next week or so. George Russell 4th, only 9 points behind Verstappen. Despite Russell being so slow, he still had a decent points hold compared to the drivers around him. Charles Leclerc 5th, Lewis Hamilton 6th, Antonelli 7th, Alex Albon 8th, Esteban Ocon 9th, and into 10th, Nico Hülkenberg going 1 point ahead of Isaac Hadjar, who did not finish in the points yesterday. And then on the constructor side, McLaren over 200 points clear of their nearest rival, being now Ferrari, who are only 1 point clear of Mercedes. That fight for second between Ferrari and Mercedes is going to be very interesting. Red Bull 4th, obviously didn't score a point yesterday, and they are being cut adrift in that fight for second. Williams in 5th, Racing Bulls 6th. I don't know why I said Haas I thought were 6th in the championship, because I completely forgot that Racing Bulls, of course, finished in 6th with Liam Lawson, which is, of course, 8 points. So yeah, Racing Bulls in 6th, and only 19 points behind Williams. And I'd fancy Racing Bulls to catch Williams at this rate. Haas then in 7th, only 1 point clear of Aston Martin, who are only 2 points clear of Sauber. That battle for 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, hotting up a lot. And then Alpine getting cut adrift in last place. Looked like they were going to score some points, but it all fell apart for the Alpine team in the race. And talking of the race, let's just go through what the race pace was like in the Grand Prix, so you can understand, obviously, just how the results ended up the way they did. McLaren, obviously, were the fastest team, and on average, they were about a quarter of a second quicker than Ferrari over the course of the Grand Prix. Ferrari's pace was a lot better after the first pit stop compared to McLaren, but ultimately, on the same strategy, McLaren were always going to beat them. And then you have Mercedes in 3rd, a second pretty much off the pace of McLaren. How embarrassing. Mercedes literally were the quickest team in Canada, and then 2 weeks later, 1 second off the pace, which is pretty bad for a team like Mercedes around a track like the Red Bull Ring, which is pretty short and simple. Sauber then, just behind them, 4th quickest team in the race. That is quite incredible. And then Haas just behind. Then Racing Bulls and Aston Martin. Of course, we're on a one-stop strategy, so their pace at times was, I wouldn't say deliberately poor, but we have to factor in that they were on a one-stop strategy, so their pace in the race was not going to be as good as others on a two-stopper, which obviously the two-stop was the fastest strategy, even though it did work for a couple people going for a one-stopper. Red Bull, obviously, slow. That's with Antonelli. That's with Yuki Tsunoda, who finished the race. Verstappen never did a lap. And then Alpine 9th. And, of course, Williams did not, or there wasn't really enough data for Williams from the Grand Prix because both of their cars were out by, I think, lap 15 or so. So, yeah, horrible weekend for the Williams team. But let's get on to the teams, and we'll start with, obviously, the race winners, McLaren. And Lando Norris had it a lot harder in that Grand Prix than I think a lot of us were expecting. Oscar Piastri had a brilliant start round the outside of Charles Leclerc at turn 1. Then got a run on Norris, tried to have a go, didn't get the move done. Obviously, the safety car then came out, but once the safety car came back in, Piastri consistently kept Lando under pressure until Lando made his first pit stop. Had a couple goes. There was one lap where Piastri did get the move done into turn 3, but then Lando cut back underneath and got the move done into turn 4. Maybe on a different day, Piastri could have overtook Lando for real in that first stint and got the win, but ultimately, Lando did just enough over the race distance to keep the lead and win the race. With Piastri, I thought he had a very good race. His pace was very, very good compared to Lando. The only issue was obviously what happened with Franco Colapinto just after Piastri made his second stop. Colapinto obviously was trying to overtake Tsunoda. Tsunoda got back past him, and then Colapinto stupidly squeezed Piastri onto the grass. Obviously, Colapinto was being lapped. That was such a stupid incident from the Argentine, and that cost Oscar, I think, enough time to where Oscar couldn't really have a go again with DRS. So who knows ultimately what could have happened at the very end if Colapinto had not done what he did. But McLaren, very quick, very good in the race, and yet a great result, obviously, a 1-2 finish, which McLaren don't get as often as you think they do. They've only had it, I think, 3 or 4 times this season, a 1-2 finish. So, yeah, McLaren, great result for them. And obviously the Constructors' Championship has been wrapped up for a few races. Now, the Drivers' Championship, though, looking very good for McLaren because Max Verstappen now is 61 points behind, and Piastri and Norris only separated by 15 points in first and second. So, yeah, looking great for McLaren. On another day, maybe Piastri could have took the win, which would have been a massive win for him, especially compared to his championship rivals, but it was still a good performance from him, and I think he'll still be at least pretty satisfied with how the race went compared to how or what happened for Max Verstappen, who I still think is his most likely championship contender in terms of pure skill, because Lando Norris, we know, will continue to make the mistakes through the season. This coming Grand Prix this weekend at Silverstone, as long as it's dry, and who knows if it'll be dry, it is the British weather we are trying to predict at the end of the day. But if it is dry, I think McLaren will be as comfortable pretty much as they were at this Grand Prix. They should be locking out the front row and finishing first and second at Silverstone this weekend if it's dry. But if it's wet, then of course Max Verstappen at that point will come into play in the race weekend. But in dry conditions, I just don't see how McLaren are stopped at Silverstone, and we'll see who comes out on top out of the two McLaren drivers. Obviously, Lando Norris, it's his home Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri, though, don't count him out. He has been pretty strong himself at this particular track the last couple years. So yeah, don't count out Piastri for having a not just good result, but a great weekend and possibly winning the British Grand Prix, which I think is absolutely doable for the championship leader. Let's go on, though, to Ferrari, because, yeah, Ferrari, the result, considering they are slower than McLaren, the result was good, third and fourth. It was the best they could have got, so I'm not going to moan too much about that. One thing I will say, though, is I don't understand why they didn't at least try to do a one-stop strategy. They had the tyres. It's not like they didn't have enough tyres available to be able, or the right type of tyres available to do it. They did. I just don't know why they didn't bother to try it. Because, I mean, look at Liam Lawson and Fernando Alonso. They did try it, and it did just about work. And I think Ferrari, when the McLarens pit, Leclerc was close enough that he could have gone an extra 10 laps and made it work. So I really don't understand why Ferrari didn't go for the one-stopper, because at least then you could say, if you're Ferrari, that you tried to win the race. They didn't bother to try. They just settled for third and fourth. I really don't get why they did that, because if Leclerc had stayed out, it would have been quite a few laps before the McLarens would have caught up to Leclerc. So, yeah, I think he could have absolutely, easily pulled off a one-stop strategy in that race. But the only thing I can think of as to why Ferrari, or the two reasons why they didn't do it, is one, they just accepted third and fourth. But secondly, maybe because McLaren went onto the hard tyres for the second stint, maybe Ferrari thought that McLaren were maybe at that point committing to a one-stop race. So maybe that was part of Ferrari's thinking, but I would have tried it anyway, at least with Leclerc, going for a one-stop strategy. And then if McLaren still beat Leclerc, fair enough. At least you would have tried to win the race, but I really think they should have at least tried. And it would have made the race as well a lot more interesting had they done that. But for some reason, they didn't bother. But yeah, third and fourth, boring race from Ferrari, but a good result. This weekend at Silverstone, I don't expect it to be as good for them because it's just a track layout that I don't think suits them as much as the Red Bull Ring. They do have an upgrade coming, though, at Silverstone, so we'll see how that works for them. But in dry conditions, I think they'll be, at best, the third best team. And if they could get on the podium, that would be a pretty great result, dry or wet, for Ferrari. So, yeah. Not high expectations. I think the next chance for them to possibly win a Grand Prix is going to be at Spa in a month from now at the Belgian Grand Prix, which is in a few weeks' time. But yeah, good result in Austria, and we'll see what they do at Silverstone. Again, I'm not expecting much. Next up, I think we'll go on to Red Bull next up, because more to talk about really than Mercedes, who were just shit slow. Red Bull had an absolute disaster, of course, at the Red Bull Ring. Max Verstappen obviously was cost by the yellow flag at the very end of qualifying. He would have probably qualified at least on the second row, if not third. And that could have really changed his weekend if he ended up there. And because he ended up more so in the pack in 7th place, obviously that puts you more at danger of being collided into by another driver and took out of the race, which is exactly what happened. Antonelli lost control of his car, went up the inside at turn 3 and took Max Verstappen clean out of the race. Antonelli rightfully getting a 3-place grid penalty for the next Grand Prix at Silverstone. But for Verstappen, that is very costly because he's now 61 points behind, and lucky to an extent that Oscar Piastri did not win that race. Because if Piastri won that race, I think at that point I may have said at that point that Max was out of the championship. But I still think, again, that it is still just about possible. But these next couple races at Silverstone and Spa is really going to decide whether he does have a chance or not. At Silverstone, again, in the dry, the best I can see for him is third. At Spa, we know he can pull off magical things there and even probably win the race in dry conditions, given just how amazing he is at the Spa-Francorchamps circuit. At Silverstone, though, this weekend, he's going to have to hope for wet weather. That's the only chance he has if he's going to beat the McLarens and win the British Grand Prix. We'll have to see whether the weather does play in his favour. But yeah, it is very close, his championship to being over. Yuki Tsunoda had an absolutely terrible race, colliding with a couple drivers, Lance Stroll and then Colapinto. Tsunoda, I know the Red Bull car is difficult to drive, but Tsunoda is not performing well enough in that car. The car is not as bad as he's making it look, and he has got to step it up. But yeah, Red Bull, no points scored at the Red Bull ring. That is quite poor, I must say, from Red Bull. And it is quite the contrast to even last year for the Red Bull team, just how far they have fallen in the last few months. And yeah, we'll see what happens at Silverstone, but I don't have the highest hopes for Red Bull at this point. And Mercedes-Benz, we will go on to quickly. Yeah, Mercedes were just absolutely terrible. The only reason I can think of is, again, the heat. They just did not perform well in those really hot and humid conditions. Saying that, it was pretty hot in the Canadian Grand Prix. So, you know, it was a bit strange to see, them so slow in those conditions. But George Russell even confirmed after the Grand Prix yesterday that Mercedes in hot races are still nowhere after having still the same issue in the last couple of years regarding that problem. So, yeah, Mercedes, absolutely terrible. George Russell got the best result he could, but yeah, that was just an absolutely horrendous Grand Prix for Mercedes. Obviously, Antonelli took out Verstappen and eliminated himself on the first lap. So yeah, awful from Mercedes. And at Silverstone, you'd imagine it'll be cooler, but at the minute in the southeast of England, it is very, very hot. So we'll have to see whether it will be a bit cooler at Silverstone. If it is and we get some rain, of course that theoretically should help Mercedes, but I don't have the highest hopes for Mercedes. I think in the dry, I think they'll probably be the slowest of the front four teams. In the wet, maybe they can be quicker than Ferrari, but I'd be surprised if they're top three material at all during the whole weekend. I just don't think the Silverstone circuit really suits them that much. So, yeah, Mercedes, not very high hopes. I think you're going to have to wait probably until the Belgian Grand Prix to see another good result from the Silver Arrows. But, yeah, those are the front-running teams. I know this podcast has been quite a bit shorter than usual, but to be fair, there's not been really a lot to talk about from the front-running teams this weekend. Even though it was a decent race, a lot of the front-running teams didn't really do much during the race itself. So, yeah, that's just the way it was. Again, congratulations to Lawson, Bortoletto, Hulkenberg, Ocon, and Alonso for scoring points, especially Lawson, Bortoletto, who absolutely needed those results. And we'll see how those teams do at Silverstone. In terms of the midfield, I'm expecting Racing Bulls to be the team to beat at Silverstone in the midfield pack. They should have a very good car around that Silverstone circuit. It should be similar to what we saw at Suzuka earlier this year, where Racing Bulls were very, very quick. So yeah, watch out for Racing Bulls this weekend at Silverstone, especially if you are going to the British Grand Prix. But yeah, that is it for this podcast reviewing the Austrian Grand Prix. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. So yeah, the plan this weekend, I will be doing both a qualifying and race watch along. I'll be live on Saturday, an hour and a half before qualifying at 1:30 p.m. UK time. And then on Sunday, the race starts an hour later than usual for European races and starts at 3 p.m. UK time. And for that, I'll be live as usual 2 hours before lights out at 1 p.m. UK time. And I will be joined by co-commentator Niblo to bring you the British Grand Prix. And then this time next week, the day after the British Grand Prix, there will be a podcast reviewing the events of that race at Silverstone. So make sure to join us for all that content coming up this weekend and this time next week as well. But guys, until this weekend's British Grand Prix and the podcast reviewing it next Monday, until then guys, it has been me, Chazza HD. Goodbye.